Welcome back to the breakdown. Today we're breaking down Epitalon, and guys, this is one of the most interesting peptides to me. Specifically when it comes to telomere expansion. If you're unfamiliar with what a telomere is, it is the little tips at the ends of the chromosomes, and they carry DNA, but they also act as like a protective layer. And the main purpose of them is it's kind of like they use the shoelace aglet. So if you've got your shoelace, that's your chromosome, and then the ends, the little tips of them, they have these little aglets. You know, the aglets, the little thing on the shoelace. It was in a Phineas and Ferb episode. Phenomenal episode. If you haven't seen it, go watch it. But it's a protective layer that carries the DNA. Every time the cells divide, the telomeres get a little bit shorter. Now, cellular replication is life. That is what it is to continue to exist. That's why when you get a cut on your arm and it heals back over, the speed at which your cells are replicating is how quickly that cut is going to heal. Right? How quickly do you regenerate? When you're younger, that happens a lot faster. As you get older, that part starts to slow down. So when you age, your telomeres start to get shorter and shorter because every time the cells divide, the amount that it can divide the next time gets shorter, right? So the little telomere right at the end. And once they reach a certain point where they don't divide anymore, cells die. And then if enough of them die, you die. And that's kind of what aging is, right? So when your skin is wrinkling, for example, also, that is not any other scenario other than your cells are just not replicating as quickly as they used to, which is why you're not regenerating new skin. So what the proposed science says for Epitalon is that it can actually lengthen the telomere to give it the ability to replicate more. Divide the cell more longer. What that means is pretty crazy because that would insinuate that you could actually expand not only your lifespan, but the rate at which you stay youthful in that lifespan as well. Now, the data on this is not conclusive and this is still going through rigorous trial, but I did try it myself and I'll tell you guys exactly what I noticed. The National Institute of Health does have a theory that the human body has a certain amount of times that its cells can replicate. And once that amount runs out is when the cells die. Epitalon seeks to extend that number. I took the peptide myself. I'm gonna give you guys my findings and see how they relate to what we're seeing in the medical research. Telomeres are like the little tips at the end of every chromosome. You know, chromosomes, XX woman, XY man. Well, some people are starting to disagree with that. And if you are one of those people, a whole other host of problems. But for right now, we're gonna talk about science. The little tips at the end of those chromosomes that carry the DNA information, those are the telomeres. Now, the longer those are, the more those cells have the ability to replicate and continue to carry on that DNA and that genetic code. Now, obviously, I'm not sick, old, and dying, so we're not going to be able to tell if this has lengthened my life by any means, but there is substantial research going into whether or not that is the case. So we're going to find out more of that as we go. What I did notice in myself and what you do see in some of the research is the melatonin balancing and the melatonin production reset. What I find incredibly interesting is Epitalon's proposed effects on the pineal gland, which is where your melatonin is produced. Melatonin, if you don't know, is the hormone that gets released in the human brain when it's time to go to sleep. By far the most interesting study I think that Epitalon's had on the effects of melatonin production was done in 2001. They had a big group of monkeys that they took that had declining melatonin as well as increased cortisol production. They take this group of monkeys and they say, we're going to introduce Epitalon to half of these monkeys and we're going to see how it makes their bodies react. Something really cool happened where the monkeys that were introduced to Epitalon, a lot of them noticed not just spikes in melatonin production, but it also reset their ability to produce their own. So they found that the monkeys were able to, after stopping Epitalon, have normal melatonin production after and reset their circadian rhythm so they were falling asleep at the right time, as well as extreme drops cortisol, which is pretty congruent with what I found for myself. At this time, I was tracking everything on my Whoop, and I was getting really low recovery scores. If you know me, you know I like to track everything on my Whoop because I think it's just the easiest metric. I don't have to think about it. It just sits on my arm. Now, when I'm noticing this lower HRV as well as I'm not getting into the right level of sleep, that could be one of a million different things. And I'm someone who likes to identify what those things are and just kind of manipulate them for my own well-being. When I noticed the low HRV and I couldn't really pinpoint it, I decided to try the Epitalon. And when I did the Epitalon, something pretty remarkable happened. You know, during the first couple days of it, you don't notice much of a difference. But then once I reached day 5, roughly day 10, you notice it, right? Like you just sleep better and not just sleep better, but you just feel the energy throughout the day. When you have a real proper rest, which most people think they do, it's like, oh, I sleep 8 hours. I'm sure I'm sleeping fine. That could not be further from the truth. I was getting more sleep when I was in the red recovery, but I just didn't get the actual rest. Your body needs to go into deep sleep. It needs to go into delta sleep specifically. And they make several other, compounds that can help you with this kind of stuff. But I noticed a very congruent finding in myself that the monkeys did in this experiment, where the stress levels just came all the way down and the actual rest just felt so refreshing. It was incredible. I was walking around with, almost like a light feeling, a positivity about me. I had a little extra pep in my step because I just felt good. Now, where this gets really interesting is where you look at its effect on the pineal gland right here in the brain. There's another study done in 2011. It was called the 15-year human study, pretty popular. And what they looked at is, if you can manipulate and affect the pineal gland, can you slow down aging? Can you keep people more youthful? And they had some pretty crazy findings. What they noticed was significant improvement in circadian rhythm, as well as metabolic rate, which are two of the most impactful things in the human body when it comes to rest, recovery, and anti-aging. And I can say the same for myself. In my experience, you just feel the difference. And the most recent study was done in 2020. It's posted on mdpi.com. It shows a group of people where they took Epitalon, same thing, to try to manipulate the pineal gland. What made this experiment really interesting is they had real human results that showed they could manipulate the cycle of a cell. They could decide how many times that cell could replicate by expanding those telomeres. If they were to find conclusive evidence that they could do this, that would be a dramatic game changer in the way that we look at life expansion, as well as quality of life and longevity. Because in essence, that is what aging is your telomeres just getting so short that your cells can no longer divide. If you can find a way to keep those cells dividing, I mean, that's a milestone when it comes to how long we can keep people alive and thriving, right? Not keeping people hooked up alive to machines where they're vegetables. I don't believe that's any quality of life, but to each their own. That's kind of their own deal. But this would be a pretty remarkable finding. So I'm interested to see, as we go further on this experiment, what happens. Further research is now getting looked at with Epitalon for antioxidants, immune system, metabolic rate, all these different factors that they think this thing can do. To me, I find it so interesting, like what could be the potential of a compound like this in terms of what we look at, medicine is for people. If this were to become FDA approved someday, it would disrupt so many industries. You wouldn't need so many of these, life extending treatments that are like a lot of this crap that gets peddled out of, oh, here's the longevity blend of whatever herbs and berries of random crap that's probably not even. Now, here's who the compound could be potentially problematic for, is definitely going to be cancer patients. The last thing you want if you have any kind of cancer in your system is those cells replicating more quickly than they need to, right? In fact, you actually want to destroy those as quickly as possible. I don't believe anybody in a cancerous state would be looking at this as a life-extending treatment. Now, of course, you've got all the basics, like normal people who can't take stuff, anybody who's pregnant, any adolescent, anything like that, all of that would be pretty much out of the question based on what I'm seeing. But the further you look into the research with this stuff, it starts to beg the question, if it can show all of these results that they're finding in these studies, why isn't it being rushed out to people? Why is that not the number one priority? And you start to ask, well, who's in control of that? My hypothesis, and this is completely a guess based on what I know about the industry, but this should not be used as any sort of fact. It's a peptide. So it already exists in the human body. It would be really difficult for a medical company to put a patent on something that naturally occurs in the human body. When you talk about pharmaceutical companies and what their motives are, I mean, they're a business at the end of the day. Their job is to make money, and they make a lot of it. They're really good at what they do, actually. For them, where's the incentive to make something like that? They can't really put a patent on it. That means they can't capitalize on the monetary value that it provides. I own a business. I wouldn't do anything for free either. It might come in the future where people can maybe put that aside for a second and try to figure out what the best alternative is for our health. I am a believer that we do not have a very effective health system. I don't believe we have a system that is designed to keep people as healthy as possible. Now, I don't think anywhere has this down perfect, but I do believe there's room for a ton of improvement. And that's kind of what I strive to do in my own world. Is I have parents, I have a grandfather who had several strokes as well as a brain aneurysm. And we have Alzheimer's in our family. And the more I dive into this industry, I just look at how few cases of this exist in certain parts of the world and what they do differently than we do. It's exciting, but it also kind of lights a fire under me because had I known any of the ways to research what I know now, I feel I could have made a difference in those people's lives. You can't sit there and dwell on the past. So all we can do now is continue to go about the research and look at it in a data-driven way. So I do want to emphasize this again. Everything on this page should be and will be continued in a data-driven, scientific way in terms of looking at what actual studies show. I will not sit here and tell you, well, this is what happened to me, so this is how the drug works. I will tell you my findings with every experiment that I go through, but I will not make claims that I cannot back up with any sort of study, or at least show that possibilities could occur based on any sort of scientific finding. That has to be the foundation of all this stuff. So that being said, this one has been a very interesting experiment for me. I'm really interested in the research on this one. If there's any others that you guys find interesting that you'd like me to cover, drop those ones down in the comments section. I want to be able to give you guys as much information as possible. Again, I do not condone the use, application, or purchase of any of these products. I believe you should talk to a medical professional if you are at all interested in any form of medicine. That being said, and I'll see you guys on the next episode of The Breakdown.